He hit her with the crystal decanter first. Not a slap, not a shove. Grant Holloway swung it like he was trying to erase her from the room, and the sound it made when it caught the side of Evelyn's head wasn't the cinematic crack you hear in movies. It was wet, dull, the kind of sound that makes your stomach drop before your brain even understands what happened. She went down against the marble floor and tasted copper, and Grant stood over her in his $1,000 shirt with his chest heaving and his face twisted into something she didn't recognize anymore, though maybe she never had. "Where is it?" he said. "Where's the drive, Evelyn?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. The room was tilting. Outside, Chicago was being swallowed by a storm that had rolled off Lake Michigan like a punishment. Thunder cracking so loud the penthouse windows shuddered in their frames, lightning throwing white sheets of light across the skyline every few seconds. 42 floors up, the world below looked like it was drowning. And Evelyn Ashcroft, née Holloway for 3 years too long, lay on the floor of her own living room and thought, "This is it. This is how it ends." She was 34 years old. She had a law degree she hadn't used in 4 years. She had a closet full of dresses chosen by someone else, a social calendar managed by someone else, an entire life that had been quietly, systematically dismantled by the man now crouching over her with blood on his signet ring. If you've ever wondered what you would do in that moment, if you've ever sat in a comfortable chair and thought, "I would fight back, I would scream, I would never let it get that far," I need you to understand something. It doesn't work that way. By the time it gets to that far, the fighting has already been beaten out of you. Not all at once. Slowly. Over years. So slowly you almost don't notice until you're on the floor counting the grout lines in the marble, because focusing on something small is the only way to survive what's happening to your body. If that were you, what would you do? Before we go any further, if you're watching this and you want to follow Evelyn's story all the way to the end, hit that subscribe button right now. Stories like this one don't come often, and I don't want you to miss a single moment of what happens next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that penthouse floor. The first time Grant Holloway hit Evelyn, it was 14 months into their marriage, and he apologized for 45 minutes afterward. He cried. He was genuinely convincing when he cried. She'd give him that. He held her face in both hands and told her she was the only real thing in his life, and she believed him the way you believe something you desperately need to be true. By the second time, the apology was shorter. By the third time, he didn't apologize at all. He just poured himself 2 fingers of scotch and told her she shouldn't have pushed him. And by the time Evelyn found herself on the floor of their penthouse during a thunderstorm, with a gash along her hairline and the carpet fibers pressing into her cheek, there were no more apologies. There were only demands. The drive. Always the drive. She'd found it 6 weeks ago tucked inside the false bottom of his study safe, a matte black encrypted USB no bigger than her thumb. And she'd hidden it without knowing why, operating on the kind of animal instinct that bypasses conscious thought entirely. She hadn't even known what was on it. She'd just known, somewhere beneath all the fear and the exhaustion, that it mattered. Grant grabbed her by the shoulder and hauled her halfway upright, and she got a full look at his face in the lightning flash. And what struck her wasn't the rage. She'd seen his rage before. What struck her was the fear underneath it. Grant Holloway, who had never been afraid of anything or anyone in the entire time she'd known him, was terrified. "Last chance," he said. His voice had gone very quiet. That was always worse than the shouting. "Tell me where it is." "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. He hit her again. She went back down, and this time she wasn't sure she was getting up. Her ears were ringing. The storm outside obliterated all other sound for a moment. A sustained crack of thunder that rolled across the sky like something structural had given way up there. And in that brief white noise interval, Evelyn did something she hadn't done in years. She thought about her father, Judge Raymond Ashcroft, 61 years old when he died of what they said was a cardiac event in his study. A man who'd spent 30 years on the federal bench without once taking a bribe, without once bending a ruling because someone important needed him to. A man who had told her, when she was 12 years old, that integrity was the only thing nobody could ever take from you. She hadn't been able to protect his integrity. She hadn't even attended his funeral without Grant's hand on her elbow, steering her, managing her grief. She was thinking about her father's voice, the specific cadence of it, the way he paused before saying something he wanted to make sure she'd remember. When 3 knocks hit the front door. Not a knock the way a neighbor knocks. 3 deliberate, measured impacts. The kind of knock that doesn't expect to be ignored. Grant went very still. He straightened up. He smoothed the front of his shirt. This reflexive gesture of respectability that even now, even in the middle of what he'd been doing, he couldn't stop himself from performing. He looked at Evelyn on the floor, and something moved behind his eyes. Not remorse. Calculation. Get up, he said quietly. Clean your face. She didn't move. The knocks came again. Same rhythm, same unhurried certainty. Grant crossed to the door himself. Evelyn watched him from the floor and understood. In the loose, unfocused way you understand things when your head has been rung like a bell. That whoever was on the other side of that door was someone Grant was more afraid of than he was of her finding the courage to run. That was interesting. Even through the pain, that was genuinely interesting. Grant opened the door. The man in the hallway was perhaps 45, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of stillness that doesn't come from being calm. It comes from having spent enough years in rooms where panic costs you everything. He wore a charcoal wool coat, shoulders damp from rain. No tie. No entourage visible, though Evelyn would learn later there were 2 men in the stairwell and 1 at the lobby desk downstairs. He looked at Grant. Then, without any particular urgency, he looked past Grant at Evelyn on the floor. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at Grant, and something in his expression changed, not dramatically, nothing you could easily name, but it changed the temperature of the room. "Mr. Holloway," he said. His voice was low and carried no accent except the flat Chicago of someone who'd grown up in it. "May I come in?" It wasn't a question. Grant stepped back. His name was Lucian Moretti, and Evelyn didn't know it yet, but she'd heard it once before. At her father's funeral, which was the last time she'd been allowed to have a private conversation with anyone, one of her father's old colleagues had leaned close and said, quietly, that Raymond Ashcroft was one of the few judges in the city the Moretti family had ever genuinely respected. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. She'd been too destroyed by grief and too distracted by Grant's hand pressing into the small of her back like a warning. Lucian walked into the penthouse and didn't look at the space the way most people did. Most people walked into Grant's penthouse and looked up. At the ceilings, the art, the view. Lucian walked in and looked at the exits, and then he looked at Evelyn. "You should sit," he said to her. Not unkindly. She didn't move. Old habit. Wait and see which way a situation was going before you commit to anything. He nodded slightly, like that was a reasonable answer, and turned to Grant. "You've missed 3 payments," he said. The arrangement was very clear about what happens after 3 payments. Grant had shifted into his boardroom mode, the voice he used in investor meetings, the posture that said competence and control. "Lucian, I appreciate you coming personally. That tells me we can be direct with each other. I have liquidity issues that are temporary. I can demonstrate that if you'll—" "How much does she know?" Lucian said. Grant stopped. "About what?" Grant said carefully. "About any of it." Lucian didn't gesture toward Evelyn. He didn't need to. He meant her specifically. "She's not involved in my business," Grant said. Lucian looked at Evelyn again. She had pushed herself up to sitting, back against the base of the couch, because being on the floor felt like surrendering something she wasn't willing to surrender yet. Her head was throbbing. She could feel that her left eye was beginning to swell. "She doesn't look uninvolved," Lucian said. "That's—" Grant started. "Don't," Lucian said. One word. Grant stopped talking. Lucian walked to the kitchen island, pulled out one of the bar stools, and sat down. It was a strange domestic gesture in the middle of a situation that was anything but domestic. He put both hands flat on the countertop. He looked at Evelyn directly. "Can you stand?" he asked her. "Yes," she said. She didn't, but she said it. "All right." He held her gaze for another moment, and she had the unnerving sensation that he was making some kind of assessment. Not the way Grant assessed her, as property to be evaluated, but something else. Something that felt almost like consideration. "There's water in that cabinet," he said, nodding toward the kitchen. "You're welcome to it." Grant made a sound. "She doesn't need—" "Grant!" Lucian's hand stayed flat on the counter. His voice didn't rise. I'm going to ask you to stop speaking for approximately 5 minutes. Can you do that for me? Again, not a question. Grant was silent. Evelyn, moving carefully because the room was still listing slightly to the left, got herself upright using the arm of the couch and made her way to the kitchen. She ran cold water over a dish towel and pressed it to the side of her head and drank directly from the tap because she didn't trust her hands with a glass right now. When she straightened up, Lucien was watching her. Not with pity. She would have hated pity. He watched her the way you watch someone navigate something difficult when you want to see how they move through it. Ashcroft, he said, your maiden name. She went still. Raymond Ashcroft's daughter, he said. It was a statement of fact, but she answered it like a question. Yes. Something shifted in Lucien Moretti's face. It was brief and she almost missed it, a tightening around the eyes, a brief press of the jaw. If she hadn't been watching him carefully, she wouldn't have seen it at all. He was a good man, Lucien said. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected any of this. Her brain was working harder than it should have been, given the head wound, and she was still assessing whether Lucien Moretti was someone who was about to make her situation better or significantly worse. Yes, she said again. He was. Grant cleared his throat. Lucien, I understand this is a difficult situation, but I think if we could focus on the actual purpose of your visit. The actual purpose of my visit, Lucien said, without turning from Evelyn, has just changed. The silence that followed that sentence was the loudest thing in the room. Grant laughed, the short, nervous laugh he used when he needed to pretend something was less serious than it was. Now come on, business is business. I have assets I can sign over tonight if that's what it takes. I have property in... The Lakeshore building is already collateral, Lucien said flatly. The Wicker Park portfolio is mortgaged past its value. Your operating accounts are frozen pending the federal audit you apparently believe nobody knows about. He said all of this the way you'd read a grocery list. What assets, Grant? The color left Grant Holloway's face. Evelyn pressed the cold cloth to her eye and watched her husband understand, in real time, that the walls had been closing for longer than he knew. She'd seen that expression before. The moment when someone realizes the story they've been telling themselves isn't true anymore. On Grant, it looked like a mask dissolving. There's the drive, Grant said. The words left his mouth and she saw him realize immediately he shouldn't have said them. Lucien turned to look at him fully for the first time since he'd sat down. What drive? Grant was recalibrating. She could see it, trying to thread a needle. I have documentation, evidence I've been compiling for 2 years, information that would be very valuable to the right parties or very damaging to them. It's leverage. I'm offering it as settlement. What kind of documentation, Lucien said. Financial records, wire transfers, evidence connecting certain business operations to certain federal officials who have very strong interests in keeping that information contained. Grant was steadying himself, settling into his salesman rhythm. It also contains information about other transactions, older ones. Lucien was very still. How old? 7, 8 years. Grant glanced at Evelyn. Just a flicker. Just a microsecond. But she saw it. The cold towel against her eye was the only thing she was certain of in that moment. Everything else had gone strange and underwater. What transactions? Lucien said. I can get the drive, Grant said. Right now, tonight. Full settlement. You walk away satisfied, I get my life back. Everybody wins. What transactions, Grant? The storm hit a particular crescendo outside. Wind and rain battering the glass, the entire city reduced to noise and water. And in the middle of it, Evelyn heard her own heartbeat. Grant looked at her. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before in 3 years of marriage. And what it contained was not guilt. It was closer to appraisal. The look of a man deciding whether to use something. Nothing that concerns her, Grant said. Old business. Before she was in the picture. Before she was in the picture? Lucien repeated. His voice was so neutral it had become a different kind of weapon. He looked at Evelyn. Mrs. Holloway, do you know where this drive is? She looked at her husband. She looked at the man she had married, who was standing in his own living room with her blood on his ring, trying to trade evidence of some unspecified old business for a debt he'd run up with a crime family. She thought about her father. She thought about the way her father had died. The phone call. The paramedics already gone by the time she arrived. the study with his reading glasses still folded on top of his open case files. He'd been 61, no history of cardiac problems. His doctor had been bewildered. Evelyn had been too submerged in fresh grief to ask the questions she should have asked. She looked at Grant. His eyes were on her with something urgent in them, a warning. Even now, even here, the warning was automatic. "No," Evelyn said. "I don't know where it is." The lie moved through the room like a third presence. Lucien Moretti looked at her for a long moment. She had the absolute, unsettling certainty that he knew she was lying and that he had decided, for his own reasons, to let her keep the lie for now. He stood. He buttoned the middle button of his coat. "Grant," he said, "I'm going to give you 72 hours. Lucien, 72 hours to produce the drive, the documentation, and a conversation about these older transactions." He picked up his phone from the counter, where he'd set it at some point she hadn't noticed. "If I don't hear from you, the terms become significantly less comfortable for everyone involved." He started for the door, and then he stopped. He was looking at Evelyn again. "Is there somewhere you can go tonight?" he asked. "Someone who can—" "She's fine," Grant said immediately. Lucien didn't look at Grant. He kept his eyes on Evelyn, and she understood that the question had been asked of her, and not of anyone else in the room. She thought about who she could call. She thought about her friends, the ones who'd slowly stopped calling, worn down by Grant's management of her social life, by canceled plans and deflected invitations, and the gradual, careful work of isolation. She thought about her mother, 3 states away, who had called her twice in the past year and gotten Grant both times. "I'm fine," she said. Lucien Moretti looked at her for one more second. Then he said very quietly, so quietly she almost didn't hear it under the storm, "He knew your father." And then he walked out. She stood in the kitchen with the cold cloth against her face and listened to the front door close and listened to the silence that followed it and listened to Grant begin to pace, his footsteps hard and deliberate across the marble. She thought about the drive upstairs, in the pocket of her winter coat in the back of the closet. She thought about the night she'd found it, slipping it out of the hidden safe while Grant was in his overnight meeting in New York, turning it over in her hands in the bathroom with the light off, not yet knowing what was on it, but knowing that it mattered. She thought about what Lucien Moretti had said. Old transactions, 7, 8 years. Her father had died 8 years ago. "Evelyn," Grant's voice from across the room. The boardroom voice again, and under it something jagged. "Look at me." She lowered the cloth. She looked at him. "Whatever you think you heard tonight," he said, "is not what it was. Lucien Moretti is a criminal who will say anything to—" "He said my father knew him," Evelyn said. Her voice was very even. "That doesn't mean—" "He said there were old transactions, 8 years ago." She could feel her hands getting cold. Not from fear, from something else. Something that moved through her chest like a current, clearing everything out. "My father died 8 years ago, Grant." Grant's face did something complicated. "Whatever you're thinking," he said carefully, "you need to stop." She looked at him. She looked at the man she had spent 3 years being afraid of, and she felt the fear. It was still there. It hadn't gone anywhere. She wasn't suddenly brave, but behind it, underneath it, something else had gotten its feet under it. Something that had her father's voice in it. Integrity is the only thing nobody can ever take from you. "I need to clean up," she said quietly. She set down the cloth. "I'm going to get cleaned up." Grant watched her walk past him. He watched her go toward the hallway, toward the stairs, toward the bedroom where her winter coat hung in the back of the closet. He didn't stop her. He didn't know yet that he should have. The winter coat was exactly where she'd left it. Evelyn stood in the back of the walk-in closet with the lights off because she didn't want Grant to see the strip of yellow under the door and know she'd gone straight here. She worked by feel, her fingers moving through hanging fabric until they found the familiar weight of the wool coat, the one she'd bought herself 3 winters ago before Grant started managing the credit cards, before he decided her wardrobe was something that required his input. The drive was in the interior pocket. Her fingers closed around it and she exhaled through her nose, very slowly, controlling the sound of her own breath. It was smaller than she remembered, a matte black rectangle the size of a USB stick, featureless except for a small etched serial number along one edge. She'd held it for maybe 40 seconds the night she found it before putting it in her coat pocket and walking downstairs and making Grant dinner without saying a word. She'd been carrying it for 6 weeks. She pressed it into her palm and stood in the dark closet and listened to Grant's footsteps moving around below. The penthouse had an open floor plan, and sound traveled through it like water. She'd learned that in the first month. She'd learned a lot of things in the first month about living in a place designed to impress visitors rather than shelter the people inside it. The footsteps stopped. She heard his voice, one side of a phone conversation, the words blurred by distance and the rain still working itself against the windows. She tucked the drive into the waistband of her pants against the small of her back and pulled her shirt over it and walked out of the closet and down the hall to the bathroom. She locked the door. She ran the faucet. She sat on the edge of the tub and looked at herself in the mirror across the room and took stock. Left eye swollen. Not shut, not yet, but moving in that direction. A cut along her hairline, mostly clotted now, that would need butterfly bandages or possibly stitches. A bruise spreading along her jaw that she'd noticed only when she sat down. When the adrenaline dropped a fraction and everything she'd been ignoring arrived at once, she'd looked worse. That was the thing that got her. The fact that she'd looked worse and survived it, and told herself each time that it was the last time and believed it, and been wrong. And she was still here, still in this bathroom, still listening to her husband's voice through the floor of their $1,000,000 apartment. She opened the cabinet under the sink. Behind the spare towels, behind a box of Grant's allergy medication he never took, she pulled out the burner phone she'd bought 14 months ago at a gas station on Michigan Avenue during a 1-hour window when Grant's assistant had taken her to a dress fitting. She'd charged it twice since then, briefly, in secret, keeping it at about 30% battery because she couldn't charge it too often without the charger being noticed. She turned it on now. The screen lit up in the dark of her cupped hands. She had one contact saved in it. No name, just a number, belonging to a woman named Patricia Voss. Her college roommate for 3 years, the maid of honor at the wedding, who had called her every month for 18 months after the wedding, before the calls stopped, worn down by the same management that wore down everyone. Evelyn typed, "I need help. I need you to stay near your phone tonight. Don't call me, I'll call you. Don't tell anyone." She stared at it. She hit send. Then she turned the phone off and put it back in its pocket under the towels and stood up and looked at herself in the mirror one more time. Who is Lucien Moretti? She thought, not to the mirror, just as a thought that needed somewhere to go. And what did he mean? She knew the name Moretti the way everyone in Chicago knew it. Not specifically, not accurately, but as a shape in the air. A name you heard occasionally in connection with things that were never quite proven. Her father had known it specifically, apparently. Her father had done something for the Moretti family, something Lucien had called a debt. A federal judge who'd refused corruption, which her father had done consistently throughout his career, enough times that it had become something people mentioned about him the way they'd mention a defining trait. He had his principles. You know how Raymond was. What had that meant for a crime family? It had meant safety, maybe. Protection. A judge who couldn't be bought was also a judge who couldn't be used against you by your enemies. There was a kind of reliability in that. She wet a washcloth. She cleaned the cut on her hairline as best she could. She found the first aid kit under the sink and put butterfly strips across it with hands that only trembled a little. Then she unlocked the bathroom door and walked downstairs. Grant was standing at the window with a glass of scotch. The city spread out behind him, rain blurred and electric, the lake invisible beyond the weather. He didn't turn when she came down. "We need to talk," he said. "We do," she agreed. He turned. He looked at her, took in the butterfly strips, the swollen eye, and his expression performed something that had probably passed for remorse at an earlier point in their marriage. Now it was just a sequence of movements. She could see the mechanism. "I lost my temper," he said. "That's not acceptable. I know that." "No," Evelyn said. "It isn't." He crossed toward her. She held her ground. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she'd decided something in the bathroom, and she wasn't ready to let go of it yet. He stopped a few feet away. "What Lucien said tonight," he started, "you have to understand that man operates in a world of—" "Which part?" she said. He blinked. "Pardon. Which part do I need to understand?" She kept her voice level. "The part about the debt you owe his family? The part about your accounts being frozen? Or the part about the old transactions?" The muscle in his jaw shifted. "Evelyn." "I'm asking a direct question," she said. I'm asking as your wife of 3 years who just watched you negotiate with a mob underboss over a debt I didn't know existed, using assets I didn't know were compromised. I'm asking about the old transactions, Grant, the ones from 8 years ago. The silence stretched. You have no idea what you're talking about, he said. Then explain it to me. He set his glass down. He moved, not toward her, past her, to the couch, sitting down with the deliberate calm of a man who has decided to try a different approach. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and pressed his hands together and looked at the floor. My business has some exposure, he said. It's temporary. It's being managed. Lucien Moretti is a creditor, in his own way, and like any creditor, he shows up when payments are late. None of this is what it looked like tonight. He said your liquidity issues aren't temporary, she said. He listed your assets. He knew exactly what you have and what it's worth. He was posturing. He wasn't. She was certain of that. She'd watched Lucien Moretti's face when he listed the numbers, and there had been no performance in it. Those were facts delivered by someone who'd done their accounting. And the drive. Tell me about the drive. Grant was quiet for 3 seconds. 4. It's business documentation, he said finally. Evidence I've been building in case I ever needed leverage. It's a survival mechanism, that's all. You said the transactions were 8 years old. Some of them, yes. My father died 8 years ago. Evelyn, his heart, she said. 61 years old, no history. His doctor was surprised. I was surprised. Everyone was surprised. She watched him. She watched every small movement of his face. Were you surprised, Grant? He stood up. This is not a conversation I'm going to have with you at, he checked his watch, 2 in the morning after you hit me with a crystal decanter, she said. You can say it. It happened. After a situation that got out of hand, he said, overriding her, his voice rising for the first time. And I've already said that was wrong, and I'd like to think we're adults who can… What is on the drive, Grant? He stopped. The storm did something loud outside, a crack of thunder that hit close, that rattled the glass and shook something in the building's bones. And in the silence after it, Grant Holloway looked at his wife with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not rage, not calculation, something that looked almost like being tired. It's not what you think, he said. His voice had changed. The boardroom was gone. What was left underneath it was something raw and harder to name. Your father, what happened to your father was complicated. He was involved in things that were more complicated than you knew. He wasn't… Don't, she said. The man you… Don't, she said again, and her voice came out low and sharp in a way she hadn't planned, in a way that surprised her as much as it surprised him. Don't tell me who my father was. I knew him. You knew the version he showed you, Grant said. And what version did you know? He picked up his scotch again. He drank. He turned back to the window. Get some sleep, he said. We'll talk in the morning when this is… When it's what? When I'm calmer? When I've had time to remember how this works? She was moving now. She didn't decide to move. She just was moving, crossing the room, and she stopped about 6 feet behind him because even now, even tonight, the body's arithmetic was automatic. Keep enough distance. I want to know what's on that drive. I want to know what happened to my father, and I want to know what you offered Lucien Moretti when you offered him your wife. He turned, fast, faster than she expected. I offered him a negotiating position, he said, and his voice had gone cold, that particular cold that was always worse than heat. That's all that was. It was rhetoric. You offered me, she said, like property, like a line item. Evelyn. And he turned you down. She held his gaze, and she could feel her heart banging against her sternum, and she made herself stand still. A mobster showed you more basic decency in 30 seconds than you've shown me in 3 years. Does that register for you at all? Grant set the glass down on the window ledge. He turned to face her fully. Here's what's going to happen, he said. Quiet. The worst kind of quiet. You're going to get a night's sleep. In the morning, you're going to help me find that drive because I know you know where it is, and I know you've known for longer than tonight. And then we're going to get through the next 72 hours and come out the other side. And after that, things are going to change. I'm going to get help. For what happened tonight. I mean that. She looked at him. She had heard versions of this speech before. Not this specific version. He'd never invoked the 72-hour timeline before. That was new. But the architecture of it was familiar. The controlled voice, the promised change, the framing of her as a partner in a mutual survival exercise rather than a woman with blood drying in her hair. She had believed it before. Every time she had believed it, and she was standing here now, which told her something about the cost of belief. "Okay," she said. He exhaled. His shoulders dropped a fraction. "Okay," she said again. "Good night, Grant." She walked past him to the stairs. He let her go. She lay in the dark of the guest bedroom. She'd stopped sleeping in the master 2 months ago, and he'd let her, which had surprised her. With the drive pressed between her palm and the mattress, and her mind moving in the slow, deliberate way it moved when she was too exhausted for speed, but too afraid to stop. She thought about Lucien Moretti and what he'd said just before he left. The quietest sentence. "He knew your father." Not, "I knew your father." He knew your father. Like it was something that happened to him. Like knowledge of Raymond Ashcroft was something that had been done to Lucien Moretti rather than something Lucien had sought out. She stared at the ceiling and listened to Grant's footsteps below and thought about a man she'd never met before tonight who had looked at her swollen eye and asked if she had somewhere to go. Who had not looked at her the way powerful men usually looked at her in Grant's world, as an accessory, an ornament, a variable in some social equation. He'd looked at her like he was counting something, like he was taking a measure. She didn't trust him. She was clear about that in her own mind. Lucien Moretti was not a safe person. The two men in the stairwell alone told her that. But there was a difference between safe and honest, and she was increasingly certain that Lucien had not lied to her once in the entire time he'd been in this apartment. Grant, she knew, had lied to her constantly. There was a simple calculus in that, if she was willing to follow it. She closed her fingers around the drive and tried to sleep, and couldn't. At 4:17 in the morning, she heard Grant on the phone again. She couldn't hear the words, but she could hear the tone, urgent, low, running slightly faster than his normal cadence. He was scared. Whatever the drive contained, the 72-hour window Lucien had given him wasn't enough, and he knew it. At 5:40, the footsteps stopped. Grant had either gone to sleep or left the apartment. At 6:15, Evelyn got up. She showered. She dressed in clothes she could move in, not the structured things in her closet that Grant preferred, but jeans and a sweater and her own flat boots that she'd pushed to the back of the closet shelf. She looked at the butterfly strips in the bathroom mirror. The eye was fully swollen now, bruised deep purple-green at the orbit. She looked like what she was. She went downstairs. Grant was asleep on the couch. He'd fallen asleep sitting up, which happened sometimes, the Scotch responsible, and she stood in the kitchen and looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the man she had married in a ceremony on a rooftop with white orchids and a string quartet, in a dress that had taken 4 months to arrive, in front of 83 people who had raised their glasses and smiled. She thought, who paid for the dress? She thought, my father left me an inheritance. He died, and I used part of it for the dress because Grant said it was elegant for me to contribute. He said that exactly. Elegant. Her father's estate. What had been in it? How much? She'd been too devastated to scrutinize it. She'd handed the paperwork to the estate attorney and done what they told her and signed what they pointed at, and months later Grant had walked her through what she'd inherited, and she'd accepted his accounting of it because he was her boyfriend, because she trusted him, because she was 26 and grieving and had no idea what she was looking at. She had trusted him to tell her what her father's life was worth. She pulled her coat from the closet by the front door, a different coat, not the winter one, and put the drive in her bra. She picked up her personal cell phone and put it in her pocket. She looked at Grant one more time. She did not leave a note. She rode the elevator down 42 floors and walked through the lobby past the doorman who'd worked this building for 11 years and who always said good morning and who did not say anything this morning when he saw her face except, very quietly, Mrs. Holloway. "Can I get you a car?" She thought about it for half a second. "No," she said. "I need to walk." Outside, the storm had burned itself out. The city was wet and gray and very quiet for 6 in the morning. The particular quiet of after, when the violence is done and the world is dripping. She walked 2 blocks north and stood at a bus bench and turned on the burner phone. Patricia Voss had responded at 2:48 in the morning. "I'm here. I'll stay near my phone. What do you need?" Evelyn typed, "A place to be for a few hours." "Just a few hours. Is that possible?" She stood at the bus bench and waited and watched a sanitation truck move slowly up the block. The phone buzzed. "I'm at the Wicker Park house. Come now." Door code is still the one from the lake trip. She closed the phone and put it in her pocket and started walking. She was 6 blocks away from the bus stop when a black car pulled alongside her. She felt her stomach drop before she even looked. The specific physical response of someone who has spent 3 years learning that certain things happen after certain other things, and leaving without telling Grant was definitely in the category of certain things. But the window rolled down and it wasn't Grant's driver. It was Lucian. "You left," he said. She stopped walking. "How do you know that?" "I have a man on the building," he said. "I have a man on most things I consider unresolved." She considered that. "Am I an unresolved thing?" He looked at her face in the gray morning light, the swelling, the butterfly strips, the bruise. "Get in," he said. She didn't move. "I don't know you." "No," he agreed. "You're not a safe person to get into a car with." "Safer than where you just left," he said. She looked at him, the flat honesty of that. Not a reassurance, not a promise, just a comparative statement that he appeared to believe was sufficient, was the thing that made her reach for the door handle. She got in. The car moved into traffic. A man she couldn't see drove. Lucian sat beside her and didn't immediately speak, which was, she realized, its own kind of communication. After 2 blocks, she said, "What's on the drive?" He looked at her. "You have it." "I have it." "Then you tell me." "I haven't opened it," she said. "I found it and I hid it, and I didn't open it because I was afraid of what it would change. I had enough to manage already without adding more things I couldn't unknow." He looked at the city sliding past the window. "That was probably wise." "What's on it, Lucian?" He turned back to her. "What Grant told me last night, the older transactions. I need you to understand that I didn't know, when I first started doing business with Grant Holloway, what he'd done to get where he was. The Moretti family has standards. They're not what people think they are, but they exist. Grant misrepresented himself to us. He presented himself as a self-made developer with legitimate capital, and we extended him lines of credit and arrangements based on that representation." "And what was the reality?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The reality," he said, "is that Grant Holloway had a federal judge killed 8 years ago and stole his estate." The city outside continued past the window. The sanitation trucks and the wet streets and the gray sky and the delivery drivers starting their routes. Everything ordinary. Everything continuing. Evelyn sat in the back of a car belonging to the underboss of the Chicago Moretti family and did not make a sound. "He needed capital," Lucian said, and his voice was careful. Not gentle. He wasn't performing gentleness, but careful, the way you are around something that you understand is about to shatter. "He'd identified your father as a target years before he met you. The estate was the target. You were a secondary element of the plan, keeping the estate accessible, making the inheritance transfer look clean." She was looking at her hands in her lap. "He arranged the cardiac event," Lucian said. "He had a contact, a man who no longer exists, who specialized in that kind of arrangement. It was on the drive because Grant documented everything as leverage. He documented his own crimes because he planned to hold them over the people who helped him execute them. He thought the documentation was protection." "He married me," Evelyn said. Her voice didn't sound like hers. It came out flat and strange. "He killed my father, and then he married me." "Yes." "He sat with me at the funeral." "Yes." "He held my hand." She looked up. She looked at the window. "He cried. He cried at my father's funeral, and I let him—" She stopped. She pressed her mouth flat. She breathed through her nose, one long breath and then another. "He knew exactly what I was going through, and he was the reason, and he—" She stopped again. Lucien did not tell her it was okay. He did not offer consolation. He sat beside her and let her sit in it, which was the only honest thing to do with something like this. And she respected him for it even in this moment, even through the noise in her chest that was too large and too shapeless to be called grief or rage, and was probably both. "How long have you known?" she asked. "I suspected last night," he said, "when he mentioned the older transactions and looked at you the way he did. I had someone pull records overnight." "Overnight," she said. "You had someone pull 8-year-old records overnight. When I need information quickly, I can get it quickly." She looked at him. What do you want from me? He met her eyes. Right now? Nothing. The debt Grant owes my family is a separate matter. What he did to your father is a separate matter. What he's done to you is a separate matter. I'm not in the business of conflating things to make them convenient. But you want the drive. The drive has information that's useful to me, yes, but it's your property. It was your father's life. She looked at him for a long time. He held the look without flinching, without performing anything she could identify as manipulation. He just looked back. I want him to go to prison, she said. Her voice came back solid. Not dead. I know what you could do. I know what your family does with problems like Grant. But I want him in a courtroom. I want it public. I want every person who watched him give speeches about ethics and urban development and charitable giving to watch him walk into federal court in handcuffs. I want him to spend the rest of his life knowing that I'm outside. Lucian was quiet. Can you do that? She asked. Or does he end up at the bottom of Lake Michigan? He ends up where you want him to end up, Lucian said, if that's what you decide. That's what I decide. Then that's what happens. She turned back to the window. They were crossing the river now, the water gray and churned below. She thought about her father's study, the reading glasses on the case files, the paramedics already gone. She thought about 3 years of a marriage that had been, from the very beginning, a crime scene. She put her hand in her bra and pulled out the drive and set it on the leather seat between herself and Lucien Moretti. He looked at it. He didn't touch it. That's yours, he said. Keep it safe, she said. We're going to need it. He picked it up. He held it for a moment the way you hold something you know is going to change things, and then he put it in his coat pocket and looked out his own window. The car moved through the wet gray city, and Evelyn Ashcroft, who had walked out of that penthouse without a note, without a plan, without anyone's permission, sat in the back seat and felt the exact moment when a door closes behind you, and there is no longer any version of the world in which you go back through it. She had handed the only leverage she had to a man she'd known for less than 12 hours. She had no money of her own, no allies she could reach before Grant reached them first, no legal standing that Grant's team of attorneys couldn't complicate in 48 hours. And the one person who currently held her future in his coat pocket was someone whose family had, at some point, needed her father's protection. She was completely exposed, and for the first time in 3 years she could breathe all the way down. The Moretti estate sat on 4 acres in Kenilworth, 40 minutes north of the city, behind a stone wall that looked like architecture and functioned like a fortress. Evelyn had expected something louder. She didn't know exactly what she'd expected. She'd formed her picture of organized crime from newspapers and the occasional film, which she now understood was approximately as accurate as forming your picture of surgery from a cooking show. What she got was a house that looked like it belonged to a retired academic. Large, yes. Old brick, climbing ivy on the north face, gravel drive, a kitchen garden on the east side that someone had clearly tended through the wet spring with genuine care. The inside was different. Not dramatically. There were no weapons on the walls, no men in tracksuits, but differently. The furniture was good and the art was real, and the staff moved with the practiced efficiency of people who understood that their job required them to see very little. There were 4 men she counted between the front door and the room Lucien brought her to. A library on the ground floor, oak shelves, long table, chairs with arms that had been sat in enough to show it. Real working room, not a display. He showed her to a chair. He asked a woman named Clara to bring coffee and food, specifying both without asking Evelyn what she wanted, which she would have resented under different circumstances, but which right now was a relief because she didn't know what she wanted except to sit down and stop moving. Clara brought eggs and toast and strong black coffee and set it on the table in front of Evelyn without making eye contact and left without speaking, and Evelyn sat there and looked at the food and found that she was extraordinarily hungry, which seemed like a strange thing to be right now, except that she hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon. She ate. Lucien sat across the table with his own coffee and a folder of papers he'd collected from somewhere, and he read them while she ate, and neither of them spoke, and it was the most normal 20 minutes she'd had in recent memory. When she finished, she wiped her mouth and looked at him. "What's in the folder?" she said. "Your father's estate records," he said. "What I could pull together overnight." "How?" "I have people with access to probate records and the county recorder's office." He set the folder down. The estate was valued at approximately $3.2 million at the time of Raymond Ashcroft's death, a combination of real property, investments, and a judicial pension. "I know what he left," she said. "I signed the paperwork." "You signed paperwork that Grant Holloway prepared and presented to you," Lucian said, not correcting her, just aligning the facts. "You were 26 and you just lost your father, and Grant had been your boyfriend for 7 months. You weren't in a position to scrutinize what he put in front of you." She sat with that. "How much did I actually get?" "Based on what I can reconstruct, somewhere between 8 and 12% of the total estate value. The rest was absorbed through a series of administrative transfers, legal fees paid to firms Grant controlled through shell entities, and a trust restructuring that moved the bulk of the assets into vehicles that Grant then liquidated over the following 18 months. She set her coffee cup down very precisely on its saucer. "He stole it," she said. "All of it he could reach without triggering IRS attention," Lucian said, "which was most of it." She looked at the table. There was a small scratch in the wood near her cup. She focused on it the way she'd focused on the grout lines in the penthouse floor last night, using the small and concrete thing to anchor herself while the larger thing moved through her. Her father had spent 30 years building something. Not just the money. The money was secondary, but the work, the cases, the life of deliberate principled effort that money represented. And Grant had killed him for it and then walked Evelyn through the ruins while she cried and signed whatever he put in front of her and thanked him for being there. She wanted to feel the full weight of that. She also needed to not collapse under it right now, and those two things were in direct conflict. "Okay," she said. Lucian looked at her. "Okay," she said again. "What do we need?" He opened the folder and turned it toward her. "The drive first. My tech person will have it opened within a few hours. Once we know exactly what's on it, we can structure the federal referral. The FBI has had a file on Grant's financial dealings for about 14 months. They have pieces, but not the architecture. The drive likely contains the architecture." "Likely," she said. "I haven't seen what's on it yet." "Your people are opening it now?" "In the next room, yes." She looked at the wall between the library and whatever was on the other side of it and felt something she couldn't quite name. The sensation of something that had been hers being examined by people she didn't know in service of a plan she didn't fully control. She'd made the decision in the car. She didn't regret it, but she felt it. "I want to be in the room," she said. Lucian looked at her for a moment. "All right." The room next door was smaller, a study, converted to something that looked like a monitoring station. 2 large screens on the desk and a young man named Dario, who couldn't have been more than 30 and who had the specific focused energy of someone who slept about 5 hours on a good night and considered this a reasonable trade. He looked up when Lucian and Evelyn came in, and his eyes went briefly to her face, the swelling, the strips, before moving professionally away. The drive was open on the desk beside his keyboard, already connected. The screen showed a directory. "It's mostly clean," Dario said, pulling up the directory and talking to Lucian, but angling the screen slightly toward Evelyn in a gesture that she recognized as an acknowledgement. "He organized it well. Folders by year, by transaction, by contact, financial records going back 9 years, wire transfer documentation, some correspondence." "The correspondence," Lucian said. Dario clicked. A list of email exports appeared. "He ran everything through a private encrypted server," Dario said. "Saved copies here, probably because he didn't trust the server to stay private forever." He clicked on one. "This is from the oldest folder, 8 years, 3 months ago." Evelyn leaned forward before she could stop herself. The email was addressed to a man identified only by initials, WC, and the subject line was blank. The body of it was brief, and she read it twice before the meaning arrived fully, because the meaning was so ugly that her mind kept sliding off it, the way you slide off something slick and cold. "The timing window is confirmed. Tuesday the 14th, the housekeeper is off. The medication substitution needs to happen between 7 and 9 p.m. Confirm receipt and the second installment will transfer Thursday." Tuesday the 14th. Her father had died on a Wednesday. She remembered it as a Wednesday because she'd been in a client meeting on Tuesday evening when she got the call. She'd been a junior associate at a corporate firm. She'd been sitting in a conference room with a cold cup of coffee and a stack of due diligence binders. And the call had come in just after 9, and she'd stepped out into the hallway, and the world had simply reorganized itself. He'd been alive on Tuesday the 14th. He'd been alive during a window, and someone had been in his house. She put her hand flat on the desk. "That's enough," she said. Dario stopped. "I've seen enough," she said. "I know what it is. Keep going through it. Send everything relevant to who handles the federal referral on your side." She looked at Lucian when she said it, and she heard herself using your side the way you'd say it in a negotiation, not as an accusation but as a coordinate, and she registered that something in her framing had shifted in the last 6 hours without her entirely deciding to shift it. Lucien looked at her steadily. "We have a contact in the U.S. Attorney's Office," he said. "Someone who has been waiting for documentation like this for some time. How long will it take to put together a referral package?" "Days," he said, "not weeks." "Grant has 72 hours before you come back to him," she said. "That was the window you gave him last night." "Yes." "He's going to run," she said. "Maybe not in 72 hours. Maybe he'll try to produce something, buy more time. But when he realizes the drive is gone, when he tears the apartment apart and it's not there, his window closes in his own mind. He'll move money, if there's any to move. He'll contact people. He'll make arrangements." Lucian was watching her work through it. He didn't interrupt. "You need to freeze whatever's left before he moves it," she said. "Not through your channels, through the federal ones. If you can get an emergency asset freeze through your U.S. attorney contact with partial documentation, it would speed things up," Lucian said. "He needs to have nothing," she said. "That's what I said I wanted. Not dead, destroyed. He needs to stand in court with nothing behind him." "I can make calls this morning," Lucian said. She straightened up from the desk. Her head was throbbing where the cut was. She'd forgotten it for a while, and it had come back to remind her. She pressed 2 fingers above her ear and breathed, and then Dario said, "Mr. Moretti." His voice had changed. It had a careful quality that hadn't been there a moment ago. Lucian looked at him. "What?" "There's a secondary directory," Dario said. "I almost missed it. It's embedded in the file structure, labeled as a system folder." He pulled it up. His cursor moved through a subfolder. "It's more correspondence, but it's different. It's recent, last 4 months." He opened the first file. Evelyn read it. She read it, and then she read it again, and then she looked at Lucian. Lucian's face had gone very still. The email on the screen was from Grant. Not to W.C., the ghost from 8 years ago. To a name Evelyn recognized, Marcus Webb, who was Grant's attorney, who had been Grant's attorney for 6 years and who had attended their wedding and who had sat across from Evelyn twice in the past year when Grant's behavior had prompted her to quietly ask about her legal options. She had asked Marcus Webb, in confidence, whether she had grounds for divorce, whether she could protect herself financially, whether she had options. Marcus Webb had told her both times that her situation was complicated and that she should take more time before making any decisions. The email from Grant to Marcus Webb was dated 11 weeks ago. The body of it read, "She's been asking questions. Keep her focused on the complexity. If she retains outside counsel, we have a problem. The prenup needs to hold and she needs to not know how much it actually covers. Handle it." There was a response from Webb below it. "Understood. She won't go outside. I've made sure she trusts me." Evelyn stood very still. "He knew," she said. "My attorney knew. The person I went to when I was trying to find a way out. Grant had him. He was reporting back." Lucian didn't say anything. "For how long?" she said. "Is there anything in there that says for how long?" Dario was already looking. "The earliest email between them I'm seeing is from about 2 years ago," he said. "But there are gaps in the record, so it could be longer." 2 years. She had tried to talk to Marcus Webb for the first time about 18 months ago. Every conversation she'd had with the man about her own situation had gone directly to Grant. "Who else?" she said. Dario clicked through. Evelyn watched the screen and felt the geometry of the situation reorganizing itself around her, the walls coming in from directions she hadn't checked because she hadn't known to check them. There were 4 names she counted in the secondary folder. Marcus Webb. A financial advisor named Dennis Cho, who had reviewed her own account with her 6 months ago and told her she had less than she thought. A woman named Cheryl, no last name in the email, just Cheryl, who had been a friend, the kind of friend who called and met her for lunch and seemed to be the one relationship Grant hadn't managed away, whom Evelyn had confided in more than she should have. She's starting to trust the Voss woman again, Grant had written to Cheryl. I need you to be available. Make sure she doesn't make contact with the Voss woman outside of plans you know about. Evelyn thought about Patricia Voss's face. Patricia's apartment in Wicker Park. The text she'd sent at 6 in the morning. Come now. Door code is still the one from the lake trip. She thought about the fact that Cheryl knew Patricia. They'd all been at that lake house together, 5 years ago, before the marriage, the last real trip Evelyn had taken with people who were entirely her own. She thought about the door code. If Cheryl knew Patricia, and Grant knew Cheryl, and Cheryl reported back, then Grant might already know where she'd been planning to go. She had not gone to Patricia's. She'd gotten in Lucian's car instead. That had been instinct, or luck, or something that she now recognized as the one functional decision she'd made in the past 8 hours. I need to warn Patricia Voss, she said. Her voice was steady, but she was already moving toward the door. Right now, I need… Evelyn. Lucian said it sharply enough that she stopped. She looked at him. Your phone, he said. Your personal phone. If Grant has resources that have been tracking your movements and communications… She pulled her personal cell out of her pocket and looked at it. How long does it take to put a tracker on a phone? She said. In the right circumstances, about 90 seconds, Lucian said. He's had years of the right circumstances. She turned the phone over in her hand. She'd had it for 3 years. Grant had given it to her when she switched carriers. He'd set it up himself, transferred her contacts, done the whole thing while she made dinner and felt grateful. She put the phone on Dario's desk. Dario looked at it, then at Lucian. Check it, Lucian said. Dario connected it. He worked for about 90 seconds. Then he looked up. Monitoring software, he said. It's thorough. Call logs, texts, GPS, app usage. It's been reporting to an external device for, he clicked, approximately 30 months. 30 months. She had been carrying a surveillance device for 30 months. She had held that phone when she cried. She had held it in the bathroom with the door locked, thinking she was alone. She had used it to read articles about domestic violence and resources and what constitutes abuse because she had been trying to figure out whether what was happening to her was real. And the whole time, she took a breath. She took another one. Okay, she said, the word again. The word that had become her way of swallowing things. Okay. Patricia Voss, Lucian said. Do you know her address? Yes. We'll send someone. She'll be brought here or taken somewhere safe. She won't be left exposed. Evelyn looked at him. You don't know her. She matters to you, he said simply. That's enough. She sat down. She didn't decide to. Her legs just made the decision for her, and she went down into the nearest chair and sat there with her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands for a moment. Just a moment. She allowed herself exactly that. The person who had been her attorney. The person she thought of as a friend. The phone she'd carried. The apartment she'd lived in. 3 years of a life that had been, in some fundamental sense, a supervised enclosure. Every exit she thought she'd found had been pre-mapped and pre-blocked by a man who had started engineering her containment before she'd finished grieving her father. He had stood at the graveside and held her hand while his contact's bank transfer cleared. She came up out of her hands. The prenup, she said. Lucian waited. Grant said it protects him in the event of divorce, she said. Marcus Webb told me it was standard and that it was complicated and that I should wait. What does it actually say? Lucian looked at Dario. Is there a copy on the drive? Dario checked. Yes, there's a scanned document. Pull it up. Dario pulled it. She read. She was a lawyer, not a family lawyer. She'd been corporate before she stopped. But she could read a contract, and this one was not as complex as Marcus Webb had made it sound. It was actually fairly clear. In the event of divorce, she received what she'd brought into the marriage in provable liquid assets, which Grant had already transferred and diminished, plus 5 years of a spousal support calculation based on her pre-marriage income, which had been entry-level associate salary. In the event of divorce, she got enough to live modestly for 5 years if she was careful. After that, she was on her own. The estate her father had built over 30 years, gone. He designed it so leaving would be survivable enough that it looked like she had options, Lucian said, reading the document alongside her, but not survivable enough that she'd actually be free. She, Evelyn said. I'm sorry, Lucian said. You? Yes, she said. Me. She closed the document. She turned to look at Lucian directly. I want to talk about what you want. From me. Not the philosophical version, the operational version. What does this arrangement cost? He looked at her without blinking. The drive is what I came for. The rest of it is your business. The rest of it has involved your staff, your contacts in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and someone going to secure Patricia Voss, she said. That's not nothing. It's not, he agreed. So, he was quiet for a moment. My family has debts we pay and debts we collect, he said. Your father protected us once. Not actively, not as a partner, but by being what he was. Incorruptible. In a year when certain parties were attempting to use the federal bench against us, Raymond Ashcroft refused 3 separate approaches. He couldn't help us, but he wouldn't hurt us. That mattered. He paused. What Grant did to him was also done to a man my family owed. I don't like debts going unpaid. You're honoring a debt to a dead man through his daughter, she said. That's one way to describe it. What's another way? He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. I sat in your living room last night and watched you get up off the floor, he said. That's another way. She held his gaze. She was trying to find the manipulation in it. She was looking for it with everything she had, because she'd spent 3 years with someone who was expert at concealing manipulation behind apparent sincerity, and she knew her calibration was damaged. She knew she couldn't fully trust her own read. But there was a difference between Grant's sincerity and this. Grant's sincerity had always been trying to sell her something. Lucian looked like a man who had simply decided something and was stating it. She didn't trust him fully. But she didn't need to trust him fully. She needed to trust him enough to move through the next 72 hours. And enough was a different calculation. All right, she said. Then I want to be useful. I don't want to sit in your library while people manage things around me. I know Grant's business, not the criminal architecture, but the legitimate face of it, the brand relationships. I know which reporters have been trying to get to him for years and what they're each specifically looking for. I know his schedule, his contacts, his habits, his pressure points. Whatever package you're building for the U.S. Attorney, I can make it better. Lucian studied her. You'd be putting yourself directly in the process. If Grant's legal team identifies you as a cooperative witness, I'm already in it, she said. I walked out of that penthouse with the only thing that connects all of this. My name is already on it. He was quiet. Then, Dario, set her up with a workstation. Dario looked up. He nodded. He didn't look surprised. She was pulling her chair to the second desk when Dario's phone rang. He looked at it, looked at Lucian, and answered it without putting it on speaker. His face changed. Not much, but enough. He said 3 words, hung up, and looked at them both. Grant left the building, he said. About 20 minutes ago. He wasn't alone. He had 2 men with him. Evelyn felt her stomach tighten. Where was he going? Lucian said. That's the thing, Dario said. He didn't go to his office. He didn't go to any of the properties. He went to a building on West Huron. He pulled up something on his screen. The building is listed under a holding company. We ran it this morning as part of the financial sweep. He paused. Mr. Moretti. The building's ownership traces back 4 transfers. Final beneficial owner is your cousin. The room went completely quiet. Evelyn looked at Lucian. Lucian's face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. Not anger, not surprise, something older and more contained than either. Marco, he said. Not a question. The holding company matches his offshore structure, Dario said. The one you had me document last year. Lucian stood up from the desk. He was very still, in the way that stillness stops being calm and becomes something else. How long? He said. How long has Grant Holloway had a relationship with Marco? I don't know yet, Dario said. Find out. Lucien's voice was flat. Find out before Grant gets back in a car. Marco Moretti was Lucien's cousin. She knew the name because Lucien had mentioned it once, briefly, in the car on the way here. A passing reference, the kind that doesn't register until it becomes relevant. She knew nothing else. She looked at Lucien's face and understood enough. Grant hadn't come to the Moretti family through legitimate channels, through some arm's-length credit arrangement. He'd come through someone on the inside. Someone who had his own reasons for bringing Grant Holloway inside the family's financial orbit. Someone who had perhaps known or discovered what Grant had done and found it useful rather than disqualifying. Someone who had, possibly, known for some time that Lucien had shown up at Grant's door last night. "He knows I'm here," Evelyn said. Lucien looked at her. "Marco knows you picked me up this morning," she said. "If Grant went to Marco, he went to tell him, and Marco knows this house." Lucien's jaw set. He pulled out his phone and began typing. Outside the window, the morning had moved on. The gray had brightened to a thin, pale winter sun that put no warmth in the air, but illuminated the garden in flat, colorless detail. The stone wall, the bare oak trees, the gravel drive where Lucien's car had brought her an hour ago. A safe house that was no longer safe. A plan that had a puncture in it. And a woman who had walked out of one trap that morning was beginning to understand the precise dimensions of the one she might have just walked into. And the only remaining question was whether the man standing 3 feet away with his jaw set and his phone in his hand was part of it or as blindsided as she was. She watched Lucien's hands as he typed, the tension in them, the specific quality of a man dealing with something he hadn't prepared for. And she made her decision the way she'd made the one in the car, not slowly and not safely, but with the whole weight of the situation pressing her forward. "Tell me about Marco," she said. Lucien looked up from his phone. "If we're moving," she said, "I need to know what we're moving toward." He held her gaze for 2 full seconds. Then he put his phone in his pocket. "Marco has wanted to run this family for 15 years, he said, and he's been building toward it in ways that I have been too slow to fully see." His voice was level, and the levelness cost him something, she could tell. If he's been managing Grant Holloway as an asset, if he brought Grant into our operations deliberately and has been using him as leverage inside the family, then last night wasn't just Grant trying to pay a debt. He paused. "It was Marco testing whether I could be maneuvered." "And the drive," she said. "If the drive contains what I think it contains, the documentation of everything Grant has done, does that documentation implicate Marco?" Lucien looked at her. "If Marco knew what Grant did to your father," he said carefully, "and used that knowledge as a control mechanism over Grant, then yes. The same documentation that destroys Grant also points directly at Marco." The morning light came through the window, cold and clean and entirely indifferent. "Then we have a problem," Evelyn said, "that is significantly larger than 72 hours. Lucien Moretti looked at her with an expression that was not fear. She was learning to read him quickly, out of necessity, and this wasn't fear, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked like the moment a man realizes the board he's been playing on is larger than he thought, and some of the pieces belong to someone he trusted, and the woman sitting across from him, who has been awake for 30 hours with a bruise covering half her face, might be the only person in the room whose motives he can currently verify. "Yes," he said. "So tell me what you need," she said, "and let's move." They moved in 11 minutes. That was how long it took Lucien to make 4 phone calls, Dario to copy the drive's complete contents to 2 separate encrypted servers with different geographic locations, and Clara to appear in the doorway of the study with a bag already packed. Not for Evelyn, for Lucien, which meant Clara had done this before, had read the temperature of a situation and prepared without being asked, and Evelyn filed that away as information about the kind of household this was. Evelyn had nothing to pack. She had the clothes she was wearing, the burner phone with 30% battery, and the knowledge that every other resource she'd thought she had this morning had been either compromised or never real to begin with. She was getting very tired of discovering what wasn't real. Lucien's convoy was 3 cars. She rode in the middle one with Lucien and a man named Reyes who sat in the passenger seat and hadn't spoken since she'd met him 40 minutes ago and had the energy of someone who considered speech an inefficiency. They moved north, away from the estate, and Lucien was on the phone for most of it, speaking in low, fast sentences that she caught pieces of but didn't try to assemble. She looked out the window and thought, Marco Moretti had been building toward something for 15 years. That was what Lucien had said. 15 years of positioning, of patience, of whatever architecture an ambitious man constructs when he wants something that belongs to someone else. Grant Holloway had been a piece of that architecture, brought in deliberately, managed from inside, used as leverage and probably as a financial instrument and possibly as a weapon pointed at Lucien's credibility within the family. What did that mean for the drive? She turned it over. Grant had documented everything as his own protection. She believed that, It fit with what she understood of Grant's psychology, the compulsive need for leverage, the instinct to collect evidence the way other men collected property. But if Marco had known about the documentation or suspected it existed, then the drive was a threat not just to Grant but to Marco. And Marco had known, or learned, that Grant was being called to account last night. Lucien had gone to Grant's penthouse as a creditor. But from Marco's perspective, Lucien showing up at Grant's door was a crisis, because if Lucien applied real pressure, Grant might produce the drive to buy himself mercy. And if the drive contained what it contained, Marco's arrangement with Grant would be exposed to the one person in the Moretti family with the standing to act on it. So Marco needed the drive gone. And he'd known this morning that Evelyn had left the penthouse. He'd known she'd gotten in Lucien's car. And he knew the estate. He wasn't testing whether you could be maneuvered last night, Evelyn said. Lucien looked at her from across the back seat. When Grant came to Marco this morning, she said, he wasn't reporting in. He was already following Marco's instructions. Marco's been running Grant through this whole thing. The missed payments, your visit last night. Marco may have engineered the timing. Lucien's eyes were steady on her. If Marco controls the debt mechanism, she said, he controls when the debt gets called. He chose last night. He sent you to Grant's apartment knowing the situation was escalating, knowing Grant was unstable, knowing there was a drive that might exist. He wanted to see what came out of it. She paused. And then you picked me up and took me to the estate, and he saw exactly what came out of it. He wanted me to find the drive, Lucien said. He wanted you to find it, and he wanted to know where it went, she said. And now he does. The car was quiet for a moment. Reyes in the front seat shifted slightly, not speaking, but listening. The drive is on 2 encrypted servers, Lucien said. Does Marco know about those servers? A beat. Dario manages them. How long has Dario worked for you? 4 years. How long has Marco been building this? Another beat. Longer. Dario is clean, Lucien said, and his voice was firm, but she heard something underneath the firmness. A fraction of a hairline crack where certainty had been before she asked the question. I'm not saying he isn't, she said. I'm saying we need to move the contents of those servers somewhere Marco can't predict. And we need to move them now, before we make any contact with the U.S. attorney. Lucien pulled out his phone. He looked at it for a moment. She could see him working through it, the same geometry she'd been working through and arriving at the same place. He made a call. Dario, he said, the servers. Move everything to the Chicago archive and wipe the current instances. Do it now. A pause. No. Now. Before you do anything else. He hung up. The car moved through the northern suburbs, the streets getting quieter and more residential, old trees and big yards, and the specific Midwestern stillness of a winter morning that's decided to be cold without committing to snow. Where are we going? She said. Safe house in Evanston, he said. Marco doesn't know it. It's not in any record associated with the family. Whose name is it in? He looked at her. Something crossed his face that she thought might have been the beginning of a smile, except Lucien Moretti appeared to have agreed with himself at some point not to smile casually. A retired school teacher named Loris Vance, who has never heard the name Moretti and never will. Clean, she said. Yes. All right. She turned back to the window. We need Grant. We have the drive. We need Grant to corroborate it in front of a federal prosecutor, she said. The drive is documentation, but documentation can be challenged. Chain of custody, authentication. Grant's legal team will spend 6 months arguing its validity. We need Grant on record. We need him to confirm what's on it before he realizes that confirming it is what destroys him. And how, Lucien said carefully, do you propose we do that? She had been thinking about this since the car left the estate. He's going to come looking for me, she said. Not because he loves me. Don't. I know what it is. Because I have the drive and I'm the loose variable. He will want to find me and contain the situation before the 72 hours expire. That's his instinct. Control the narrative, contain the damage, manage the exit. You want to let him find you, Lucien said. I want to control where he finds me, she said, and what gets recorded when he does. The Evanston safe house was a 2-story craftsman on a tree-lined block that looked indistinguishable from every other 2-story craftsman on the block. Inside it was sparse and functional, clean surfaces, basic furniture, heavy curtains, A kitchen stocked with the kind of provisions that suggested periodic use rather than constant habitation. There were 3 other men already there when they arrived, none of whom were introduced by name, all of whom moved like the situation had been explained to them, and they'd accepted it without needing the full picture. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and Lucian sat across from her, and they worked. Not the way she'd worked in corporate law, not with a team and a deadline and the comfortable scaffolding of process around her. They worked the way you work when the scaffolding is gone, and all you have is what you know and how fast you can think and how much you're willing to bet on your own read of the people involved. She knew Grant's psychology. Lucien knew the financial architecture. Together they sketched out what a federal case would need: testimony, documentation, evidence of intent, a cooperating witness if possible. The drive covered documentation and intent. Grant himself, properly handled, could provide testimony that no defense team could subsequently discredit because it would come from him. The question was the approach. He needs to think he's the one doing the maneuvering, she said. If he feels cornered, he shuts down, he lawyers up, he goes to ground, and the legal fight takes years. But if he thinks he's found an angle, if he thinks there's still an exit that preserves something for him, he'll talk. What does he think he has? Lucian said. Me, she said. He still thinks he has leverage over me. 3 years of that marriage, he's built his whole mental model around the assumption that I'm manageable, that I'll bend towards survival, that I'm not this. She gestured at herself, at the table, at the 2 of them in this kitchen. He hasn't updated his model. You want to use that? I want to let him walk into a conversation with me thinking he's in control, she said. And I want everything he says in that conversation on record. If he finds out it's recorded, he won't, she said, because he won't imagine I'm capable of setting it up. She held Lucien's gaze. That's the thing about spending 3 years making someone feel small. You start to believe the thing you made. Lucien was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you need? A phone I can reach him on that looks like my personal phone. A recording device I can carry. And a location that feels like neutral ground to him. Somewhere he'll agree to meet because it feels like his choice. The penthouse, Lucien said. She thought about it. The marble floors, the 42 floors of distance from the rest of the world, the place where she'd been on the floor 12 hours ago. The penthouse, she said. It took 4 hours to set up. Lucien's people were thorough in the way that comes from doing this in conditions where imprecision has permanent consequences. The recording device was a small adhesive unit that Reyes attached to the inside of the collar of a jacket. Not her jacket, one provided from somewhere, charcoal wool, her size. The kind of thing that implied she'd had time to change when, in fact, it just meant someone in this organization knew how to estimate. The phone was a mirror of her personal device, same number routing through a different handset. She sat in the craftsman kitchen and wrote out mentally what she needed Grant to say. Not a script. She knew better than to write a script. Grant would sense a script. He was good at detecting performance because he'd been performing his whole life. She needed to know the destinations and let the route be live. She needed him to confirm her father's death was not natural. She needed him to confirm the estate transfer was intentional. She needed him to make a threat that established ongoing coercion. If she got those 3 things on record, the U.S. Attorney's contact had something to work with that no defense team could hollow out. She rehearsed it in her head while Lucien was on his phone in the other room and Reyes stood near the window, looking at the street, and the afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor in the slow way of winter light that has somewhere to be but isn't in a hurry. At 2:47, she called Grant. He picked up on the second ring, which told her everything about the state he was in. Grant Holloway did not pick up on the second ring. Grant Holloway let things ring 4 times and sometimes 5 because he had read somewhere that immediate availability communicated weakness. Evelyn. His voice was controlled. Not perfectly. There was a tightness in it, a compression, the sound of someone who has been managing a bad morning and is not going to let it show. Where are you? Safe, she said. I need you to come home, he said. We need to. I'm not coming home, she said, but I'll meet you. A brief pause. She could feel him recalibrating. Where? The penthouse, she said. Tonight, 7 o'clock. Tonight is... He stopped himself. Yes. Okay. Tonight. One condition, she said. No lawyers, no security, just us. Another pause. Of course, he said, and she could hear him decide that this was manageable, that she was scared and trying to negotiate, that she wanted to come back and needed a face-saving way to do it. She could hear him put on the shape of a man in control. Just us, 7 o'clock. She hung up. Lucienne was standing in the kitchen doorway. She hadn't heard him come back. He agreed, she said. He had 2 men with him when he left the estate this morning, Lucian said. He'll bring them to the building. I know. I'll have people in the lobby and on the floor below the penthouse. I know that too. He looked at her. You don't have to do this part yourself. I can… No, she said. It has to be me. If anyone else is in that room, he won't say what needs to be said. She met his eyes. He spent 3 years underestimating me. This is the last time that's useful. The afternoon moved. She ate something. She couldn't have said what. Clara had arrived at some point with food, and she consumed it as fuel without tasting it. She went over the 3 things she needed, again and again, not obsessively, but methodically, the way she used to prepare for depositions. You know what you need. You build the questions backward from the answers. You trust yourself in the room. She had not been in a room trusting herself in a very long time. At 5:30, Reyes drove her to a parking garage 3 blocks from the penthouse building, and she sat in the car for a moment and breathed. You don't have to go in until you're ready, Reyes said. The most words she'd heard him say all day. I'm ready, she said. She wasn't. She also was. Both things. She got out of the car. The lobby of the building was marble and warm light, and the doorman who always said good morning. He looked at her as she came through the door, and she saw him take in her jacket, her face. The bruise was spectacular now, fully bloomed, green and purple from jaw to cheekbone, and his expression stayed professionally neutral, except for something in his eyes that wasn't neutral at all. Evening, Mrs. Holloway, he said. Evening, she said, and walked to the elevator. 42 floors. She watched the numbers climb and kept her breathing even and thought about her father's voice, the cadence of it, the pauses. Integrity is the only thing nobody can ever take from you. She thought, he was right. They took everything else. They didn't get that. The elevator opened. The penthouse door was unlocked. She pushed it open. Grant was standing at the window again. Different glass of scotch, same window, same city spread out behind him. He turned when she came in and looked at her, and she watched his face do its assessment, cataloging the jacket, the set of her shoulders, the fact that she'd come alone, and file it as confirming what he'd expected. Manageable. Thank you for coming, he said, as if she'd done him a favor. She crossed the room and sat down on the couch. She didn't take off the jacket. You look, he started. Don't, she said. He stopped. He sat in the chair across from her. He set his scotch on the coffee table between them and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, the same posture from last night, the posture that said, I want to be straight with you. I know you're scared, he said. I'm not scared, she said. I'm tired. Evelyn, I want to understand what happened, she said. I want you to help me understand it. Before I make any decision about anything, I need to understand what I'm dealing with. He looked at her. He was reading her. She could feel it, the specific attention of a man who spent his life reading rooms and people. And she kept her face open, a little lost, the face of a woman looking for an exit that required her to believe him one more time. What do you want to know? He said. The drive, she said. I want to know what's on it, all of it, not pieces, everything. He was quiet for a moment. It's complicated. Simplify it for me. He picked up his scotch. He drank. He set it down. There are things I've done in my career, he said, that were legally ambiguous, transactions that pushed boundaries. I documented them because documentation is protection. If you have the record, you control the narrative. I'm not the first businessman to operate in gray areas. My father's estate, she said. Is that a gray area? A beat. Very brief, but she felt it. The estate administration was complex, he said. Your father's affairs were in some disorder when he died. I helped streamline it. The attorneys took significant fees, that's standard. How much did I actually inherit, she said. He looked at her. From my father's estate, she said. How much? Actual number. Evelyn, that's not… Tell me the number, Grant. His jaw moved. Your father's estate had certain encumbrances that weren't visible at… Did you move money from my father's estate into entities you controlled? She said. The room went very still. She could feel the recording device against her collar like a second heartbeat. She held Grant's gaze and kept her face as close to neutral as she could get it, and waited. You've been talking to someone, he said. His voice had dropped. Answer the question. Who have you been talking to? Not a question. A demand. Was it Moretti? Answer the question, Grant. He stood up. She held still. He moved toward her. Not fast, controlled, but moving into her space the way he did when he wanted her to feel the implication. And she didn't move. She stayed on the couch and kept her face level. Stop, she said. He stopped. 6 feet away. His chest was moving faster than normal. Sit down, she said, and answer the question. Something moved through his expression. She'd seen versions of it before. The moment when he decided which mode to use, when he was running the calculation of what would work best right now. And she watched him arrive somewhere she didn't expect. He sat down. Yes, he said. I moved assets. I restructured the estate in ways that were beneficial to me. Your father he was not going to approve of our relationship. He was going to use his estate to influence your decisions. I needed to preempt that. She kept her breathing even. His cardiac event, she said. Was it natural? He looked at her for a long time. Grant, she said. It was managed, he said. The timing. There were health vulnerabilities that were accelerated. The word fell into the room like something dropped from a height. Accelerated. She wanted to stand up. She wanted to do something with the shaking that had started in her hands, quiet and controlled, but there, unmistakable. She pressed her palms together in her lap. You had my father killed, she said. I had a situation managed, he said, and his voice had the boardroom flatness back, the professional distance that was its own kind of horror. Your father was an obstacle, and he was my father. Her voice came out differently than she'd intended. Lower, stripped, without the veneer she'd been maintaining. You sat at his funeral. Evelyn, you held my hand at his funeral, she said. You cried. Grant looked at her, and something passed through his eyes that she still, even now, couldn't fully classify. Not remorse. She'd stopped believing in Grant's remorse before she stopped believing in most other things. But something. Something that knew it was being looked at clearly for the first time. I did care about you, he said. That part was real, while you were stealing my inheritance. It was more complicated than, stop saying complicated. Her voice was sharp, sharper than she'd planned. She pulled it back. She breathed. The prenup, she said. Marcus Webb told me it was standard. He was reporting back to you. Webb works for me, yes. He was never my attorney. He was an attorney, Grant said. He gave you competent advice. The advice was just designed to keep me from leaving, she said. Grant picked up his scotch and looked at it and put it down without drinking. What do you want? He said. Whatever you want from tonight, tell me. We can make an arrangement. I want to know who helped you, she said. With my father. The name of the person you paid. That person is dead, he said. Who else knew about it? A pause, small but visible. Who else, Grant? No one, he said. She looked at him. She thought about Marco Moretti and the West Huron building and the holding company traced back 4 transfers. She thought about what it would mean if Grant was protecting Marco right now, whether from loyalty or fear or the calculation that Marco was still his best remaining exit. Marco Moretti, she said. Grant's face went very still. He knows, doesn't he? She said. He found out and he used it. That's how he brought you in, not as a business opportunity, as a resource he had leverage over. Grant stood up again. This time he didn't move toward her. He moved away, to the window, to the city, the classic Grant Holloway retreat to the view when the room got too real. You need to stop, he said. You need to stop saying that name. He's going to let you go down for everything, she said. All of it. He'll keep his distance and watch you take it, and the deal he's made you about some kind of exit. It doesn't exist. Marco will be at whatever trial comes out of this, and he'll be in the gallery, not the defendant's table. Enough. He turned from the window and his face had changed again. The mask was off in a way she hadn't seen before. Not rage, not calculation, just a man who was cornered and knew it and was still trying to find the move that didn't exist. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't understand what Marco is. You have no idea how deep this goes. Then tell me, she said. Help me understand. If I tell you, he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word, a fracture in the professional surface, then I have nothing left. You have your life, she said. He looked at her. She meant it differently than he'd take it. She meant that the alternative she was offering, through Lucien, through the U.S. attorney, was prison, and not what Marco would arrange for him if he became fully expendable. But she knew Grant would hear it as she was willing to deal, that she was still, somehow, his. She watched him believe that. She watched him reach for it like a man going down in deep water reaching for something floating past. Marco has been running a parallel operation inside the family for 8 years, Grant said. Financial instruments, influence structures, 2 sitting state judges he owns outright. He used my situation to get a position inside the Moretti financial network, and he's been using that position to redirect money through my development entities as laundering vehicles. I was the mechanism. He stopped. I had limited choice. You had a choice before my father died, she said. He had nothing to say to that. All of this, she said. You'll say it to a federal prosecutor. He stared at her. I'll go to prison. Yes, she said. Evelyn, Marco Moretti will be in the cell next to you, she said. Or he won't, and you'll carry everything alone. That's the actual choice. She held his gaze across the coffee table, across the ruins of 3 years and 8 years, and everything that had been taken. There's no version where you walk away from this, Grant. There's only the version where you decide how much of it you carry alone. The silence stretched. 42 floors below, Chicago continued without them. The traffic, the lake, the ordinary machinery of a city that doesn't stop for private catastrophes. Grant Holloway sat back down. He put his face in his hands. He stayed like that for 11 seconds. She counted, and then he looked up and his eyes were dry, and his face was the face of a man who has finished one calculation and is starting another. I want immunity for the financial crimes, he said. I want the murder charge as a plea to a lesser. That's not my decision, she said. Then who do I talk to? Before she could answer, her phone buzzed. She looked at it. The message was from a number she didn't recognize, but the text was 3 words. Get out now. She looked up at Grant. She looked at the window. She looked at the front door. And in the half-second before it happened, she registered the sound. Not from outside, from the floor below, something structural and wrong. And then the lights went out. The entire building went dark. Grant was on his feet. She heard him moving. She was already moving toward the door, away from the window, her hand on the collar of her jacket where the recording device sat, where every word Grant had said in the last 40 minutes had been captured and was sitting on a receiver in a car 3 blocks away with Reyes's hand on it. The emergency lighting clicked on, thin red-edged strips along the baseboard. The front door of the penthouse opened from the outside. Not Grant's key. Someone else's. And Evelyn Ashcroft stood in the red-edged dark of her former life and looked at the door coming open and understood, with total clarity, that the next person through it would determine whether everything she'd built in the last 18 hours would survive the night or burn with her still inside it. Marco Moretti was not a large man. That was the first thing Evelyn registered as the penthouse door swung open into the thin red emergency light. Not the 2 men flanking him, not the gun one of them carried low at his side, but Marco himself. Slight. Maybe 5'10", a good suit going slightly damp at the shoulders from outside air. He had Lucian's dark coloring, but none of Lucian's stillness. Marco's eyes moved constantly, cataloging, the eyes of a man who is always running threat assessments because he has always had something to protect that wasn't entirely his. He looked at Evelyn first, then he looked at Grant. Sit down, Grant, he said. The voice was quiet and almost pleasant. The voice of a man arriving at a meeting that's been scheduled rather than a confrontation he's forced. Grant sat. Not because he decided to. His knees made the decision for him, the same way Evelyn's had in the Evanston kitchen hours ago. The body knows things before the mind agrees to know them. Marco walked into the room. His 2 men stayed at the door. He looked around the penthouse with the particular expression of a man inventorying something he considers himself to already own. Where's the drive? he said, still pleasant. I don't have it, Evelyn said. He looked at her. I know you had it this morning. You gave it to Lucien. He said Lucien's name the way you say the name of someone you've been competing with for so long that the name has become a sound you make without feeling. Lucien's people copied it to 2 servers. I've been in Dario's business longer than Lucien knows, so I know where those servers were, and I know they were wiped an hour ago. He tilted his head slightly. So where did the contents go? You'd have to ask Lucien, she said. Lucien is indisposed, Marco said. The floor moved under her. Not literally. The building was solid, 42 floors of steel and concrete, but something in her chest dropped the way floors do in dreams. What does that mean? She said. It means Lucien is currently occupied with a situation at the Evanston house that I arranged for him. Marco crossed to Grant's bar cart with the ease of a man in his own home. He poured 2 fingers of Grant's scotch and looked at it. He's alive. I want to be clear about that. My cousin and I have disagreements, but I'm not… This isn't that. He set the glass down without drinking. I just needed him occupied while I handled this. This, Evelyn said, meaning me. Meaning the loose end, Marco said. He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd come in, and what she saw in his eyes was not cruelty. That would have been almost easier. It was pragmatism. The look of a man who has decided something is a problem and is working through the solution with the same emotional register he'd use on a scheduling conflict. You've had a very busy 18 hours, Mrs. Holloway. You've spoken to my cousin at length. You've gone through the drive's contents. And 20 minutes ago, you sat in this room and got Grant to say things into a recording device he apparently didn't notice. Evelyn's hand moved involuntarily toward her collar. Don't, Marco said. Not sharply, just informatively. One of the men at the door had crossed the room before she processed the movement. He reached past her and removed the recording device from her collar with the efficiency of someone who had done this exact thing before. He handed it to Marco. Marco looked at it and put it in his jacket pocket. The receiver, Marco said to her. The car it's transmitting to. Where? I don't know, she said. You do know, he said. But we'll find it, so this is mostly academic. He looked at Grant. You said enough in this room tonight to put yourself in federal prison for the rest of your life. You understand that. Grant said nothing. His face had gone the color of old wax. Grant, Marco said, with a patience that was its own form of menace. I've spent 8 years managing you, 8 years of cleaning your messes and routing your liabilities and keeping certain information from certain people. I'm tired. He picked up the scotch glass and this time he drank. So here's what happens now. The recording doesn't exist. I have the device. We'll locate the receiver. The drive contents are on a server that you, he looked at Evelyn, sent somewhere in the last hour, and I need to know where. And if I tell you, Evelyn said, what happens to me? Marco looked at her steadily. You go back to your life. I don't have a life to go back to, she said. You know that. Whatever you think you're offering, a clean exit, Marco said. You leave Chicago, tonight. Resettlement resources, documentation if you need it, a number to call if you run into complications. You disappear, and this entire situation becomes a story that doesn't have a third act. He said it the way you present a reasonable business proposal. Terms, conditions, mutual benefit. She looked at him. She thought about the school teacher in Evanston who didn't know what her property was used for, about Reyes in the parking garage with his hand on a receiver, about Patricia Voss who had texted, "Come now at 2 in the morning," and was currently somewhere Lucien's people had sent her before Marco's situation at the safe house. She thought about what was on that drive and what Grant had just said in this room, and what Marcus Webb's emails proved, and what the chain of it was, all of it, the complete architecture from her father's death through 3 years of managed imprisonment to this penthouse, and this man in this good suit with Lucien's coloring and none of Lucien's honesty. No, she said. Marco blinked, just once. Excuse me. No, she said again. The word was the same size the second time. She didn't expand it or explain it. She just stood there in the red emergency light with the bruise on her face and the dead recording device gone from her collar and said no to the man pointing the exit at her like it was a weapon. Mrs. Holloway, Marco said, and the pleasantness had thinned slightly, the first sign that it was a surface rather than a substance. You're not in a position to… The server contents were sent to 3 places, she said. Not 2. Dario sent the third copy to a location that isn't in any system your people have access to because it was established 4 hours ago on a network that didn't exist 4 hours and 1 minute ago. This was partially true. Lucian had made one additional call in the car that she'd only half heard, 3 words to someone who wasn't Dario, and she had filed it without knowing why, and was now expanding it into architecture and betting everything on being right. And the recording device you took transmits with a 12-second delay buffer. Reyes has had everything Grant said in this room for the past 40 minutes. Marco looked at her. She looked back. "You're bluffing," he said. "Try me," she said. The room was very quiet. The emergency lighting hummed its low red hum. Grant was on the couch with his hands between his knees, looking at the floor like a man who has decided to stop participating in his own life. Marco set the scotch glass down. "Even if that's true," he said, "a recording of Grant isn't a recording of me. I haven't said anything tonight that—" "You told me you arranged a situation at the safe house where Lucian is," Evelyn said. "You told me you've been managing Grant for 8 years. You told me you knew the contents of the drive and the location of the servers." She watched his face tighten, the slow comprehension arriving that the thing he'd been so carefully not saying had been said by him minutes ago in this room while she stood there appearing cornered. "And the device doesn't stop transmitting just because you have the unit. The receiver captures everything in range." This was a lie. She didn't know if it was true. She had no idea what the device's actual specifications were, but she said it with the precise calm of someone stating a technical fact, and she watched Marco Moretti decide whether to believe her. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Something crossed his face, a quick contraction around the eyes that was over in under a second, but that she caught because she was watching for exactly that. He looked up. "Put her in the—" The building's power came back on. Not gradually. All at once, every light in the penthouse flooding on at full brightness after 20 minutes of red-edged dark. The sudden luminance so complete that all 3 of them flinched. In the 2 seconds of disorientation that followed, the front door came open again. Reyes came through first, then 2 men she hadn't seen before, then Lucien. Lucien had a cut above his left eyebrow that had been roughly handled, dried blood in a line down to his cheekbone, his coat gone, his shirt open at the collar. He looked like a man who had been in a room that got physical and had come out of the room, which was the only thing that mattered about his condition right now. He looked at Marco. Marco looked at him. The 2 men who had come in with Marco moved, and the 2 men who had come in with Lucien moved to match them, and the room reconfigured itself into something that was 3 seconds from catastrophic, everyone's position and everyone's math suddenly public. "Stop," Evelyn said, loud, louder than she'd planned, loud enough that it landed in the room like something physical. Everyone stopped. She was standing between the 2 groups. Not strategically, she hadn't placed herself there deliberately, it was simply where she'd been standing. And she stayed there and looked at Lucien and then at Marco, and kept her voice at the volume she'd used. "The recording is with Reyes," she said to the room, to anyone in it who needed to hear it. "It has Grant's full confession, the murder of Raymond Ashcroft, the estate fraud, the financial crimes, the names of Marco's state judges, all of it." She looked at Marco. "And the server with the drive contents has already been transmitted to the U.S. Attorney's Office as of—" She looked at Lucien. 42 minutes ago, Lucien said. His voice was steady despite everything his face was showing. "Through the direct channel. It's been received and logged." Marco's jaw moved. "It's done," Lucien said. He wasn't looking at Evelyn now. He was looking at his cousin, and what was in his expression was not triumph and not grief, but something that combined them into something harder than either. "Marco, it's done." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a structure gives way. Not loud, but total. Everything that had been held up by the possibility of a different outcome simply stopped being held. Marco Moretti stood in the middle of Grant Holloway's penthouse with a glass of someone else's scotch and the dead recording device in his jacket pocket, and looked at his cousin and understood that the 15 years were over. He didn't run. She would think about that later, about the fact that he didn't run, didn't lunge, didn't do any of the things that the situation's physics seemed to call for. He just stood there for a moment with his phone in his hand, and then he put it in his pocket and straightened his jacket and said to Lucien very quietly, "Was it always going to end here?" "I didn't know it was going here until this morning," Lucien said. That's the truth. Marco nodded. One small nod, like something being filed. Then he sat down in Grant's armchair and crossed one leg over the other and waited, with a composure that was either genuine or the most expensive performance Evelyn had ever witnessed. Reyes called it in. The federal contact, the U.S. attorney connection that Lucian had been building for what turned out to be years, quietly, in the particular way that men who are playing a long game build things quietly, had a team at the building in 31 minutes. Not because of Evelyn's bluff about the recording's range, which had been exactly that, but because the 42-minute-old submission to the U.S. Attorney's Office had included a flagged note about the penthouse address and the likelihood of a confrontation, and someone on that team had been watching a notification on their phone all evening. The federal agents were not dramatic about it. They came in with the bureaucratic efficiency of people executing a warrant rather than staging a finale. And they spoke to Grant first, who by the time they arrived had moved from wax-colored silence into a kind of deflated cooperation, the posture of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has finally, in the worst possible circumstances, set it down. He asked about immunity within the first 4 minutes. The lead agent told him that wasn't her department, but that his cooperation would be noted and his attorney should call the number on the card she gave him. Grant held the card with both hands and looked at it like it was a life preserver that he knew was too small. Marco said nothing to the agents. He asked for his attorney before they'd finished introducing themselves, and then sat in the armchair in perfect silence, which was professionally correct and personally devastating to watch, because the silence had the specific quality of a man who had already moved on from this room to the next calculation. Evelyn stood near the window while all of it happened around her. She watched the city below. Still there, still indifferent, the lake invisible in the winter dark beyond the grid of lights. She could feel the exhaustion now in a full-body way, the kind that lives in your joints and behind your eyes, the kind that isn't fixed by sleep, but by time, and something more than time. Lucian came to stand beside her. They stood there for a moment without speaking, watching the federal agents work the room. "The third server," she said, quietly enough that it was only for him. "Did it actually exist?" "It exists now," he said. "Dario established it remotely about 4 minutes before the power came back on." He paused. "You bought him the time to do it." "I bluffed." "You bluffed well." She looked at her hands on the window glass. The bruise on her face was reflected dimly in the dark of the pane. She could see the shape of it, the color, the way it had spread over the past 18 hours from a local injury into something that covered more of her than she'd realized. "Your eye," Lucian said. "I know," she said. "It's fine." "It's not fine. It needs to be looked at by someone who knows what they're doing." "Yes," she said. "Later." He was quiet. Below them, the city moved. "Marco," she said, "what happens to him?" "The same thing that happens to Grant," Lucian said. "The same courtroom, probably. The same documentation. The state judges he owns. The federal prosecutors have been looking for the thread to pull on that for 2 years, and what's on the drive is the thread." He paused. "He'll go to prison. It won't be fast. His attorneys are expensive and they'll work every angle. But it will happen." "And the family," she said. "The Moretti operation. Who leads it?" He didn't answer immediately. She turned to look at him. His face in the window's reflection was tired in the way she hadn't seen it before tonight. Not the controlled tiredness of a long day, but the deeper tiredness of someone who has just watched something he'd held together for years come apart at the seams and already knows he's going to have to start rebuilding in the morning. "That's a longer conversation," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." The federal agents took Grant out at 9:47. He walked between 2 agents in his shirt and his charcoal trousers and his shoes that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he did not look at Evelyn as he passed her. She had been prepared for that to mean something, for the not looking to feel like a wound or a victory or at minimum a punctuation mark. It meant nothing. He passed her and she watched him go and felt the specific blankness that comes after prolonged adrenaline, the emotional equivalent of a room after everyone's left. Marco went out 10 minutes later. He looked at Lucian as he passed. "You should have told me," Lucian said. His voice was very quiet. "You wouldn't have understood," Marco said. "Try me," Lucian said. The same 2 words Evelyn had used 2 hours ago in this same room, in a different conversation. And Marco looked at him for a moment and then shook his head slightly, the gesture of a man who has given up on a very old argument, and walked out. The door closed. The room was empty except for Evelyn and Lucien and Reyes near the entrance and the ordinary evidence of an evening that had happened. The Scotch glass, the couch displaced from its usual position, the thin marks on the marble from people moving through a space in crisis. Evelyn sat down on the couch. She sat there for a moment and pressed her fingers against her closed eyes and breathed. Lucien sat in the armchair Marco had vacated across the coffee table and said nothing, which was the correct thing. After a while, she lowered her hands. "I need to call Patricia," she said. "She's safe. She's in a hotel in Oak Park. Dario set it up this afternoon. She knows you're alive." "I should call her anyway." "Yes," he said. "You should." She sat there for another minute. Then, "I don't have anywhere to go tonight." It wasn't a request. It was just the fact of it, stated plainly, in the way that you state facts when you're too tired to frame them as anything else. She had come into this building 3 hours ago with a recording device and a plan and 30% battery on a burner phone. And she had no apartment, no money she could access before morning, no wardrobe except the clothes she was wearing, and the address on her driver's license was 42 floors above her and now constituted a crime scene. "The craftsman in Evanston will be clear in an hour," Lucien said. "Reyes will take you whenever you're ready." "And you?" "I have things to deal with tonight," he said. He said it matter-of-factly, without drama, the way you'd say you have a conference call at 7. What he meant was that the Moretti family had just lost its underboss to a federal arrest, and someone needed to hold the structure together through the night, and that someone was him. She understood that. She understood the weight of it without needing it explained. "Go," she said. "I'll wait for Reyes." He stood. He picked up his jacket. He'd recovered it somewhere, she hadn't noticed when, and looked at her. "For what it's worth," he said. "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "Not tonight. Tonight it's still too close." He nodded. He understood that too. He left. She sat alone in her former penthouse, in the very specific quiet of a room that has been through something and is now on the other side of it. The Scotch glass on the coffee table, the displaced couch, the window full of city and dark water. She sat there for 20 minutes. She wasn't thinking exactly. She was doing something that didn't have a clean name, something between processing and simply being present in a space that had defined 3 years of her life, letting herself feel the full dimensions of it before she walked out and stopped coming back. She thought about her father's study, the reading glasses folded on the case files, the life he'd built with 30 years of principled work. She thought about the fact that she now knew what had happened to him, that the not knowing, which she'd carried for 8 years as a low-grade permanent ache, was over. That knowing was worse and also better, the way truth usually is, harder than the alternative and more livable. She stood up. She walked through the penthouse one last time, not sentimentally. She walked through it the way you walk through a space you're releasing, not to say goodbye, but to confirm you're done. The kitchen where she'd run cold water over a dish towel last night, the closet where the winter coat hung with its empty pocket, the guest bedroom where she'd lain in the dark with the drive pressed into her palm. She took nothing. There was nothing here that was hers in any sense that mattered. She rode the elevator down 42 floors and walked through the lobby past the doorman, who said, "Good evening, Mrs. Holloway," and she stopped. "It's going to be Ms. Ashcroft going forward," she said. "If you see me again." He looked at her for a moment, at the bruise, at the steady way she said it. "Good evening, Ms. Ashcroft," he said. She nodded and walked out. The months that followed were not a clean recovery. She would have said that to anyone who asked and meant it. There was nothing clean about it, nothing that resolved the way resolutions work in the stories people tell about survival. She had nightmares about the emergency lighting, the red-edged dark of the penthouse, and in the dreams she was always still waiting to see who came through the door, and the door never opened. She had days when the inside of her chest felt like a room that had been emptied of furniture and she couldn't fill it with anything useful. She had weeks when the therapy she'd started in January felt less like healing and more like digging, like every session surfaced another layer of what had been done to her that she hadn't known to name. She named them anyway. All of them. Slowly, one session at a time, with a woman named Dr. Carol Reese, who did not offer easy words and never once told Evelyn she was brave, which was the only reason Evelyn trusted her. She moved into an apartment in Logan Square in February. Small, second floor, radiators that knocked in the night. She paid for it with money from a fund that Lucian had arranged in her name, not a gift, he'd been clear, a debt repayment, the Moretti family's accounting of what her father's estate had been worth before Grant Holloway emptied it, established through the attorneys with documentation the federal proceedings had made available. She'd accepted it the same way she'd accepted most of Lucian's arrangements, not warmly, not without scrutiny, but with the practical understanding that she needed somewhere to live while she rebuilt what came next. She passed the bar re-examination in March. She hadn't been sure she'd pass it, 4 years away from active practice, 4 years of her professional identity quietly suppressed by the same hands that had managed everything else. But she sat in the examination room and worked through it the way she'd worked through every hard thing in the past 8 months, methodically, without drama, one question at a time. She passed. Grant Holloway's federal trial began in April. It lasted 3 weeks. The coverage was extensive. The Chicago papers, the national outlets, the legal analysis, and the human interest pieces, and the inevitable tide of commentary from people who had attended his charity galas and were now discovering the architecture underneath. Evelyn followed it the way you follow a thing you are both inside and separate from. She had given her deposition in January. She had answered every question for 6 hours with the complete honesty of someone who has nothing left to protect and no version of the story left to manage. She was in the gallery on the day the verdict came down. 3rd row, left side, in a suit she'd bought herself for the first time in 4 years. Deep burgundy, structured, her size, her choice. No one had approved it. No one had told her it was appropriate. She had simply decided that it was what she wanted to wear to watch her husband's life collapse under the weight of what he'd built it on. The verdict was guilty on all counts. 12 counts total. The murder charge, reduced through the plea negotiation to 2nd degree in exchange for full cooperation on Marco's case, carried 25 to life. Grant Holloway stood when they read it, and he did not look at Evelyn. She had not expected him to. She had not come for his gaze. She had come to be in the room, to be physically present in the space where it was declared, publicly and permanently, that what had happened, that her father had been a man whose death was a crime, that she had been a woman whose life had been built on a crime, that the record now said so. She sat in the 3rd row and watched the bailiff and the attorneys and the process of it, and when it was over, she stood up with everyone else and filed out into the hallway and found a bathroom and locked the door and stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrists. Not because she was in danger, because it was the same thing she'd done the night she'd found the drive. Both hands under cold water, the most basic possible return to the physical present. And her body had apparently decided this was the ritual for moments when something very large shifted. She stood there for 2 minutes. Then she dried her hands and unlocked the door and walked back out into the courthouse hallway. Patricia Voss was waiting. She'd been in the gallery too, 2 rows behind and to the right, and they hadn't spoken before the verdict because it hadn't felt like a speaking moment. Now Patricia looked at her and opened her arms, and Evelyn walked into them, and they stood in the courthouse hallway for a long time without either of them saying anything, because there was nothing to say that was as true as just standing there. Marco Moretti's trial began in September. It ran 6 weeks, and the coverage was even more extensive because Marco's operation was broader and his connections went further, and the unraveling of it took longer and involved people whose names the public recognized from contexts that weren't crime. Both sitting state judges were indicted on separate charges. The financial architecture Grant had operated as a vehicle for Marco's laundering was dissected in federal court over 4 days, a procedural intimacy that made the gallery shift with something between fascination and disgust. Evelyn testified in person. She had been offered the option of a video deposition, but she declined it. She sat in the witness box and answered the questions, and when the defense attorney tried to establish that her relationship with Lucian Moretti constituted a conflict of interest that tainted her testimony, she looked at him steadily and said that her relationship with Lucian Moretti was professional, that Lucian Moretti was the person who had ensured the drive's contents reached the U.S. Attorney's office rather than disappearing into the lake, and that the witness box was not the appropriate venue for the defense's apparent confusion about what a conflict of interest meant. The judge sustained the prosecutor's objection before she'd finished, but she'd finished anyway. Marco was convicted in October. He didn't look at her either when the verdict was read. She was starting to understand that the not looking was not a power these men retained, but a thing they defaulted to because they had no other move. Lucien was in the gallery for Marco's verdict. She hadn't known he was coming. They'd spoken twice in the months since the penthouse, brief and functional conversations about the legal proceedings and the estate recovery. And she saw him from across the room as the gallery filed out, standing near the far wall in a gray coat with his hands in his pockets, watching his cousin be led away. She made her way to him. Not quickly. The crowd moved. She moved through it, and when she reached him, he was still watching the door Marco had gone through, the particular stillness she'd learned to read as something being processed rather than ignored. She stood beside him. After a moment, he said, "How are you?" "Better," she said. "Not done, but better." He nodded. He looked at her, took in the burgundy suit, the hair she'd cut shorter in August, the fact that the bruise was 9 months gone, and the woman standing in its place was the same woman and also not. She could see him making the same calculation she'd made about him in the craftsman kitchen. Trust enough. Move enough. See what holds. "I'm opening a practice," she said. "Family law. Specifically, women in financial or domestic situations who need someone who understands what the documentation actually means and how it gets used." She paused. "I have a particular skill set for that now." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "You do." "I'll need office space," she said, "and I'll need it to be genuinely mine. No Moretti money in the structure. No connection that a defense attorney can use to suggest my client's interests are compromised." "Understood," he said. "But I'll take your referrals," she said. "If you have people who need someone like me, people who are in situations that require someone who doesn't scare easily." Something moved in his face. Not quite the smile he never let himself make, but the ancestor of one. "I have those people," he said. "I know you do," she said. They stood in the emptying courthouse hallway for another moment. The gallery had mostly cleared. Outside, she could hear the press, the questions being called, the cameras, the machinery of public record. "Thank you," she said. It was the first time she'd said it directly. She'd resisted it for months, not from ingratitude, but from the conviction that thank you was the wrong shape for what existed between them. Too small, too simple, the kind of word that closes things rather than names them accurately. "Don't," he said. She looked at him. "Your father was owed more than I was able to give back," he said. "What I did wasn't—" He stopped. His jaw moved. "The debt went the other direction. I want you to know that." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Raymond Ashcroft reading case files late in his study with his glasses on and his principles intact and his daughter asleep down the hall, a man who had never imagined the particular way his integrity would complicate her future, who had protected strangers because it was right and not because he was building something and had died without knowing how the protection would travel forward through time. "I know," she said. She put her hand briefly on Lucian's arm. One moment, her palm on his sleeve, a weight and a warmth, and then gone. And then she walked toward the courthouse exit. The press was thick on the steps outside. Cameras, microphones, reporters calling questions at anyone coming through the door. She descended the steps with her shoulders back and her eyes forward, and her burgundy suit catching the cold October sun. One reporter got her name right. "Ms. Ashcroft. Ms. Ashcroft." And she paused, just slightly, not stopping but allowing the pause to be visible, the pause of a woman who has decided which questions are worth answering on her way somewhere. She kept walking. The city spread out in front of her, wide and cold and ordinary, the lake somewhere beyond the buildings doing what it always did. Indifferent, immense, moving in its own patterns with no regard for the small catastrophes of the people on its shore. She walked into it, not away from anything, toward everything still to be built, everything not yet decided, everything that was hers because she had walked back into the fire to claim it, and come out on the other side not unburned but upright, with her father's name in a federal record that said what happened to him, with her own name on a law license, with the particular knowledge of a woman who has learned the difference between surviving and choosing. Evelyn Ashcroft walked down the courthouse steps into the October morning and did not look back. She had already decided who she was going to be.